Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 17th Annual Smart Growth Summit. After 2 years of virtual events, I am so happy to be back in person for this in-depth dialogue around one tremendously important topic, planning for Louisiana's future. And I just want to call out Boo Thomas and Cordell Heyman because they started this event. Boo started this event 17 years ago, and I'm just so proud to be able to carry the torch. So a good round of applause to Boo and Cordell. Thank you to the community advocates, the change makers, the thought leaders who have gathered at this year's summit to help us navigate this multi-layered, complex topic. That includes our incredible speakers and panelists, some of who traveled across the country to be with us, to lend their insights to these critical conversations. I also want to thank our sponsors and CPEX members for believing in the power of planning and making this convening possible. Without your support, we could not be here. And last, but certainly not least, thank you to the CPEX board and staff that work day in and day out to make our vision for Louisiana a reality. I'm honored to work alongside all of you. This is a pivotal time to be in the planning arena. We know that Louisiana's future will be impacted by many dynamic factors: economic shifts, demographic trends, current and future pandemics, and others. But there's one factor that makes planning for Louisiana's future absolutely imperative: climate change. Analysis of the most recent climate data reveals that climate change impacts are currently outstripping the pace at which we are able to mitigate and adapt to these realities. This means that the conversations we have here will not be hypothetical. The realities of life on the front lines of climate change require bold, transformative action to preserve the people, culture, and places we love in Louisiana. We undertake this work with a spirit of optimism and hope because the future we want for Louisiana is very possible. It's up to us to use the power of planning to build a bright, resilient future for our people. As many of you know, our communities face a constellation of pre-existing challenges that are and will continue to be magnified by climate change impacts. Those longstanding challenges include generational poverty, health disparities, racial inequity, environmental degradation, and a lack of economic opportunity. These challenges are largely the result of a long history of housing policy, land use and development decisions that have culminated into the situation we're in now, and we have to choose to make decisions differently with equity as a leading priority. We have to figure this out. This is why this year's summit is focused on climate, but not just climate. We know that meeting the challenges of climate change requires transformative action and a holistic, people-first approach, which is why we're focusing on climate, health, and equity, 3 overarching priorities for building resiliency and sustainability in our state. I want to take a minute to focus on this word, transformational. You know, the notion of transformational change has firmly been ensconced in philanthropic jargon, which I usually try to avoid, but transformational actions and efforts are exactly what we need right now. That's why all of you will be hearing much more about transformational change throughout the summit. In order to get ahead of the accelerating pace of climate change impacts, we can't afford half measures and watered down initiatives. We have to have the courage to make the changes we need at the scale that is required to truly transform the way we plan, develop, and live. And although the need is urgent, we're not starting from scratch. Louisiana communities have been adapting for decades, and their native wisdom is invaluable. Louisiana has positioned itself as a model for the nation with our coastal master plan. And last year, our state adopted the first statewide climate action plan in the Gulf South. Continued shifts in governance is going to be critical to our success. Some of these structures, processes, and systems that guide planning and practice were developed during a different time when the environmental, social, and economic context for planning in our state were much different than they are now. So we have to use what we know to rethink and redesign these systems to address the challenges we face today and the ones we know are coming tomorrow, and to capitalize on the new opportunities that exist within mitigation and adaptation planning efforts. Changes to governance need to happen at all scales, but especially at the state and federal level. Most of our towns and parishes do not have the capacity to manage the scope and scale of the challenges associated with climate change. So without effective guidance and support from state and federal agencies, they can't win, and we need them to win. Louisiana's Adaptive Governance Initiative is leading efforts to address these needs. In partnership with the Governor's Office and the state's Chief Resilience Officer, CPEX has been guiding this initiative, which is a multi-year effort designed to help our state agencies understand how coastal change is affecting their assets and the way they provide services to Louisiana residents, and then working with them to identify adaptation actions that address those challenges. This will enable them to take a proactive approach to managing climate change impacts as they deliver on all of their various agency missions. We are also working in partnership with the Division of Administration to develop an Office of State Planning, long overdue, but the Office of State Planning will provide support for coordinating planning efforts and resources at the state level, and it will have a role to play in providing critical data that can inform current and future planning activities at the local level too. CPEX is committed to working with our partners and communities throughout the state to figure out how we build on these successes to accelerate the pace of progress and build resilience at every level. Just as we are seeing progress at the state level governance, transformational action is underway in many communities across the state. And I want to take a minute to just lift up Gonzales as a really great example. CPEX has had the pleasure of working with them on several initiatives over the past decade, and they are setting the standard for how locals can take a lead on resilience building. So first, they started with a master plan, but the city has used the master plan and the decision makers to make land use and development decisions, and they're reaping the rewards. They began implementing their plan by updating their codes, which catalyzed development of more housing choices, green infrastructure, complete streets. That master plan also included a vision for a future rail station, and now they've just received a federal RAISE grant, enabling them to implement their plan for that station, which will be a powerful economic driver for their downtown and region. Gonzales has also focused on supporting managed retreat, a topic we're going to dive into more today. In 2020, the City of Gonzales worked with CPEX and the Natural Resource Conservation Service to complete a buyout program for its Silverleaf neighborhood. This enabled more than 40 homeowners to escape repetitive flooding. A conservation easement was established on the vacated properties, which increased flood protection for the surrounding community by improving water retention and the new green space. Over 2,000 trees were planted in that area. When we did the ribbon cutting to plant the trees, residents from the community came and were so heartfelt and thankful that they're in a better place. And by the time we started that initiative to the tree planting, they would have flooded 6 more times. And this month, Gonzales received its draft of its first climate action plan from CPEX. This plan will help the city leverage ongoing and future efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and ensure a strong and resilient Gonzales for generations to come. Beyond Gonzales, I know many of you represent communities that are doing planning, and we, CPEX, are working in more than 10 communities currently across the state. We are committed to smart planning that creates more transportation options and well-connected networks, prioritizes a range of housing options that meet the needs of people at every stage in their life, adds more parks and green space, cultivates economically vibrant downtowns and people-friendly commercial corridors. This work, alongside our climate adaptation initiatives, is foundational to our ability to achieve the climate resilience, healthy communities, and equitable places in Louisiana that we deserve. Fortunately, there are unprecedented levels of federal funding available that are closely aligned with our needs right now. With the passage of several sweeping bills in just the past 18 months, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, the United States is pouring more money than ever before into expanding the tools available to reduce carbon and greenhouse gas emissions and adapt our infrastructure to better meet the demands of our climate and environmental conditions while building economic opportunity. We can and must seize this moment to harness this once-in-a-generation funds to build transformational infrastructure systems at the scale required to meet the challenges of our climate future, which we are very certain about. With all this in mind, I want to challenge us to continue to push for the bold action and the robust investment in our people and places. That includes growing our renewable energy capacity, designing communities with an aggressive emphasis on health and equity. It means rethinking and reforming our development patterns, our infrastructure investments, and transportation systems to improve our quality of life while making our communities more resilient and adaptive to climate change. And this looks like people-centered infrastructure that expands our mobility and livability. All of these topics and more are going to be up for discussion at this year's summit. So today and tomorrow, you're going to hear more and more about what I just said. The CPEX team has carefully curated this year's summit sessions and events to engage you in helping our communities seize these opportunities and chart a course for a more resilient future. So we're going to take deep dives on transportation and mobility from a few different angles, digging into complete streets, transit, mode shift, and how we can align our transportation development strategies with bigger goals around climate resilience, health, and equity. We're going to discuss managed retreat, which is strategically moving communities and infrastructure, including homes and businesses, away from environmentally high-risk areas. We'll also focus on the critical component of planning the future of our energy grid. And this might be a new topic to some of you, but we've got to join this conversation because we need to have a voice in the kind of energy sources we need to power our future and ensure that people and businesses have access to clean, reliable, and affordable energy. And this also presents an opportunity to have new siting discussions around having more control on or insight and input into how siting is done at this critical infrastructure level. We'll also talk about how placemaking and the arts are central to our quality of life and economic development efforts. And we're going to share a new resource with you. It's called Building a Healthier Louisiana. It's a publication drafted and just released by CPEX in partnership with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Louisiana Foundation. And we're going to learn more about healthy community design, which centers social determinants of health and community planning. We'll learn about planning by doing, also known as tactical urbanism, and its potential for catalyzing change in our communities. And we even have a session that lets you all try a hand at managing flood risk in the what are you gonna do game. And that brings home the real world impacts of planning decisions. This year's summit also offers special cultural experiences, poetry, music, and visual art exhibits by Louisiana artists, as well as the Pechacucha this evening, which I really encourage and hope that you all are staying for. It is a real treat. And so don't miss these great events. Make sure you take advantage of all these opportunities to engage with the experts that we have here, the innovators who are here to help us learn, grow, and take action together. I want to close with this. We all have a role to play, whether we are practitioners, policymakers, community members, elected officials, or voters. There are real opportunities right now to work together to make the transformative changes Louisiana needs for a more resilient, livable future. So let's work together to plan for that future and make it a reality. Thank you so much for all being here. And now, to help us kick off the 2022 Smart Growth Summit, I would like to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Mitchell Silver. Mitch, as his friends call him, probably needs no introduction. He is an award-winning planner who has been at the center of many cutting-edge trends, innovative solutions, and visionary plans. He's currently the Vice President and Principal of Urban Planning at McAdams, and he previously served as the Commissioner for the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. I would love to watch a TV show about that job. He was the past president of the American Planning Association and is currently the president of the American Institute of Certified Planners. Mitch, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us in Baton Rouge. And I am going to pull up your PowerPoint, or is someone going to do that?
He's behind you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mitch.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Camille. Certainly a pleasure to be here. I usually start my presentations with a little humor, but today, looking at December 7th, you may not know this was a day that changed the trajectory of my life. 48 years ago today, I dropped out of high school. And my father joined me to drop out of high school because that's what you did back then when you were young. And I remember leaving the high school, my father turned to me, I won't say exactly what he said, but he says something like, "You SOB, you had to drop out on Pearl Harbor Day." My father was a World War II veteran, and I knew I broke his heart. And I was determined at that time, and also for my mother who passed away when I was 12, that I was going to change my life and be purpose-driven. Fast forward some years later, I ended up getting my GED, went to college, and I was selected as the salutatorian. And I remember I was giving my speech and thanking my father for never giving up on me. Literally on stage, my father runs up on the stage as I'm giving a speech to give me a hug. And so for me, it was just validation that I did the right thing, and I was determined throughout my career to be purpose-driven. And so I'm going to talk to you today about planning with purpose. Never knew that being Parks Commissioner, I would intersect all three things that Camille talked about, dealing with climate, dealing with health, and dealing with equity. And so as this opening keynote, I'll be touching on all of those themes to share with you why we all need to be purpose-driven in the work that we do. You know, I like to take a step back because planning has had a long history. And if you go back at the different planning eras, you can see from the birth of planning really in the 19th century, the technical age, urban renewal, suburbanization, public participation, I can go on and on and on. But the question is, what I want to challenge you is that the issues we face keep changing again and again, and we have to evolve and pivot to meet some of those challenges. And when we look at the 21st century, the challenges that we're facing, some of these are new. And those of you that are young, you can't Google to find a solution to these problems. Leaders are looking for innovative solutions to address some of the issues that you see here. Climate, extreme weather events, droughts, flooding, wildfires, all the things that Camille talked about. But now we have a public health crisis that we're now kind of overcoming, but for many are still wearing masks because they're concerned. Racial and social justice, divisive politics, and now what will the COVID behavior be? These are the challenges we now have to face, and I'm going to touch on some of these themes. And so there's no question this is still in the psyche, and I'm always very concerned about our youngest people here in our country that are under 5, that had a very different upbringing dealing with a pandemic and their early formative years when they develop friendships. You know, there are places where we have too little water, but as we all know, there are places where we have too much water. And all of this is creating extreme trauma to many people who have to confront some of these challenges. Out west and in California and in Australia, they're dealing with massive wildfires that are destroying memories and livelihood and businesses, all because of a changing climate. And this is one from Canada going through the same issue. And people thought this was taken a year ago. Well, it just got hotter this year. And these are trends that it could continue. And when you talk to young people, their number one challenge is a changing climate and these extreme weather events, and it's going to keep getting hotter and hotter and hotter. Now, I'm not here to depress you, but we're here to talk about the challenges. But my question to all of you, what I want to share this morning, is what is our role as planners and designers? Clearly, we can't stop climate change, but there's something we can do to start to slow it down and get the word out and plan and design differently. And so I want to talk about this thing about purpose. I believe that planning has a purpose. For one, and I've said this many times in my career, I believe that we as planners, designers, involved in the public realm are guardians of the future. We don't just care about the present, we also care about people who aren't even born yet. And we're fighting hard to make sure that we leave a better planet for them, but we're dealing with this challenge. We deal with and manage growth and change, and we deal with the risk and uncertainty about the future. That is what we do. But most of all, we protect the public interest, the public health, safety, and welfare. And I see no greater challenge in public health, safety, and welfare than the threats of climate change. We should also have a special concern of the long-term consequences of present actions. And I remind everyone that when you say no to something, you're saying yes to something else. You know, where I live in North Carolina now, very often they said no to multifamily housing, and I'm saying that means you're saying yes to veterans, seniors, and emerging professionals. We don't want you to live in our community. Is that what you're saying? Or if you take no action on climate change, the problem's not going to go away. There are consequences for taking no actions, and we have to be purpose-driven to understand that we're on the front line. We are guardians to address this challenge, even though some may not believe or agree with us. When I talk about purpose, I find my purpose in my code of ethics. We all should look at our professions. It gives us purpose, and I like to read the different professional code of conduct to understand our values and how we should operate. And so I often look at all the different professions, kind of a hobby of mine, just to understand what you're about, what drives you, what's your purpose. Because ultimately I believe that's what gives us motivation. That's why we have to do the work that we do. And so I'll just give you a highlight of a couple. I'm president of the American Institute of Certified Planners. And to me, I read this at least twice a year to stay focused on my mission, to stay focused on my purpose, that we shall faithfully serve the public interest, that we shall achieve economic, social, and racial equity, and that we should safeguard the public trust. One that I will talk later on today in this session is the public health professionals. If you read their code of ethics, it is literally 34 pages of pure inspiration. And I love reading the fact that they too want to pursue justice and equity. This is public health, human rights, and civil liberties. I understand public health professions, which is why I adore them, because I really, truly understand this sense of purpose. Now, before I start, are there any engineers in the room? Okay, we have 1, 2, all right. I used to make fun of you guys and women, but not after reading your code. And this was changed very recently. These are engineers, those of us who we often kind of say, they like to do, straight lines, concrete, safety, health, and welfare. But what I was impressed about the engineers is they have a creed that was adopted in 2021. And it's saying that I dedicate my professional knowledge for the advancement and betterment of the public health, safety, and welfare. I was quite impressed, but guess what? There's more. They have a pledge. When they receive their professional license, they actually take a pledge. And I'm going to read to you what is highlighted in red. To place service before profit, the honor and standing of my profession before personal advantage, and the public interest or public welfare above all considerations. In humility, I make this pledge. Wow. We as planners don't even have that pledge. And so for me, when you look at all the themes of our allies to serve the public interest, to protect public health, safety, and welfare, enhance the quality of humanity, we need to stay focused and be purpose-driven because of the challenges of our time. So how purpose-driven are we as we protect the public interest, health, and welfare? I'm going to share with you the approach that I took in New York City. It will be focused on parks, but you see how we thread all these themes within the work that we do. So I'll talk about this purpose-driven approach, about equity, about planning, about resiliency and sustainability, and leave you hopefully with a challenge to be inspired, because we have to fight hard to do the work that we do. These terms are used as a bundle, and I want to unpack them for you. I've been in this space for 30 years, and very often people just jumble up DEI as if it's one phrase. In fact, we acronym it as if it's some kind of thing, but it's not. And so I want to share each one of these words so you understand as I go through this presentation. If you have this lens, you will do the work a lot better. Diversity is simply the value of different perspectives, not black or white. It could be gender, it could be age, it could be political affiliation. It's the value of different perspectives. Equity is about fairness. I have a hard time explaining equity to someone because I've heard food equity, health equity, this equity, that equity. But whether you're a child or an adult, you understand what equity means. You understand what fairness means. And so we have to understand that place has flood protection. This place does not. That place had a brand new park. This community did not. It's not fair. And so if we understand fairness, it allows us to do our jobs a lot differently. Inclusion must be welcoming to all, and then access is removing barriers. But to me, the key things about these words is that equity, diversity, and inclusion is not something you do, it's who you are. If you do not go to a space being authentic and real, they'll see right through you. If I said, let's have a campaign on kindness, well, either you're kind or you're not kind. You can't fake it. So if you're not really having this in your heart, stay home and let someone else do that work for you with these public engagement meetings. This is real. And you'll see as you carry this lens how the work is very different even today. So as I said, equity is about fairness. When I was hired in New York City, the first challenge the mayor asked me to do is come up with a framework to deal with equity. He was concerned about the city, a tale of two cities. And so we worked with our staff and came up with this framework that to me was absolutely transformative. But we first had to figure out, were we being equitable? So we decided to take a look back, and I encourage all of you in your local governments to take a look back 20 years at your capital budget, and we did that. New York City spent close to $6 billion over 20 years to improve our parks, added acreage, and came up with this walk score. They wanted every New Yorker to be within a 10-minute walk to a park, and at that time it was roughly around 80%. But when I became commissioner with that equity lens, I said it's not just about proximity, it's about quality. Because there were some of these spaces I wouldn't let my child or grandchild step foot in that space, but it met the metric. Be careful with metrics. I challenged Trust for Public Land on this metric and told them it shouldn't just be access to a park, it should be access to a quality park. And you'll see what I mean in a second. So we had to find out and take a look back, and we did. We wanted to find out how many parks over that 20-year span, $6 billion, received little or no investment. And it turned out there were 215, hiding in plain sight. From kindergarten to college, a person would live there and saw no change to their park, yet other parks throughout New York City got improvements. That's not fair. And the mayor and I were determined to do something about it. How tragic. How tragic, $6 billion, yet you neglect entire population. That was not fair. So to the mayor's credit, he funded the Community Parks Initiative, and it was to transform 67 of those 215 parks. And it was a total transformation, not replacement in kind, but a total transformation. And so here's one of those parks. Isn't it lovely? Wouldn't you want to leave here right now and go visit and roll around on the asphalt? This is the Robert Moses Era Park. This counted in the walk score as a park. And that's why we have to be careful when we use a metric. And my concern here, was this a park or a parking lot? Now this one's a little bit better. It has a bench and trees, so I suppose you can go there and go on a date, have a picnic. And this is sad. This is what qualified as a New York City park. So because I have a design background, I challenged my staff that we're taking an entirely new approach as we readdress these parks, make them destinations for young people where we have spray showers they can cool off in our hotter summer. We actually call it Cool NYC. We started an initiative to keep people cool since the temperatures are getting warmer. Adult fitness equipment so that our seniors can stay healthy and engaged. We use bright colors rather than the gray asphalt to make them appealing. These are, in New York City, parts of your front yard, your backyard, your outdoor living rooms. This is where people come to connect. And then the community in our meetings said, please, green, green, green. Break up the asphalt. And we also made sure we had stormwater capture. Our parks started serving more purposes than just recreation, to deal with climate change, to deal with health, of being in green spaces. And I speaking to Corey is doing the same thing here in Baton Rouge. In New York, we called it Parks Plus, where parks serve more than one purpose, not just recreation. And then seating, quadrupled the amount of seating. Seniors love to go to the edge of the park and sit. We want them to age gracefully. So we put more seating, make sure one chair is missing for a wheelchair, for a stroller. That is what we want to do, to really create these places for dignity for people who have been neglected for so long. So very quickly, this case study, this is in South Bronx. It is now a transitioning area for the better. This park was near community college and once again neglected for well over a couple of decades. Poor access, not very welcoming at all. Now the other slides had asphalt. This one had vegetation. Unfortunately, it looked like this. When I told you I wouldn't let my child or grandchild step foot in a public space, a park, this is the one I was referring to. As a commissioner, I was embarrassed and ashamed that the community had to have this as their 10-minute walk to a park. I'd rather be closed and take it off the metric. So, because we had the money, we decided to go in there and transform it to make it a multi-generational space, places for seniors to sit, splash pads for kids, stuff for the students to do. There was a quad where they could engage and have fun. And this is what the rendering looked like when we designed it. It did open during COVID. So the students even know this space existed. This is now the space that was created that had not existed in over 26 years. And now they have a space to connect, create memories, to study, a dignified space for the seniors can go to. That is why it's so important to have that equity lens. The next story I'm going to share with you is an emotional one for me because we had another park in Brooklyn, totally asphalt, that we converted with a synthetic field, a track, rain gardens, play equipment, and an opening day, which for us is a big event. There was a Hispanic boy about 8 years old, refused to come into the park. Now we have a party, music, food, balloons, everything. He would not come into the park. And I had one of my staff workers go up to him and say, why won't you come in? And what the little boy said kind of blew us all away. He said he didn't want to go into the park because he didn't know how much it cost. It looked so nice, he thought he had to pay. He saw nothing like that in his neighborhood. There's the park, and there's little boy. And I want you to think for a second, the memories, the health, the connections, the pride, the respect and dignity, not just that boy, but everyone in that community will enjoy because of this intervention. Lives are being changed, but it wouldn't have happened if we did not have that lens of fairness to address inequities that exist in this neighborhood for so long. Before I left as commissioner, we completed 62 of 67. Now there are friends groups that take care of this public space. They take care of it. If you provide quality material in a good park, the public respects you in return, and it increased usership by 50%. The good news is, when I left as commissioner, Mayor gave me a gift, and he funded another 100 parks of the 215 to be transformed that now the new administration is going to do. It's a very powerful, powerful mission. I'm now going to talk about access. And Camille touched on this about placemaking in the public realm, which is critically important. That I believe people may eat and sleep in their homes or apartments, but they live in the public realm. That's where people go. That's what makes places have a great experience. And I believe that previous generations were consumers of goods, but the newer generations are consumers of experiences. And so therefore I challenge my staff wherever I go not just to be planners and designers, but experience builders. We're creating spaces. That's why people want to go to these spaces, because of the experience. You're now looking at New York City. This is underperforming asphalt. It was concrete. But because we can see and want to reimagine public space, it is now a destination for people to enjoy. Just tables and chairs and some flower pots. Now there's a concession. It's starting to transform the public space because the public realm belongs to the public, not to cars. We have to share the public realm with others. And in fact, when you look at New York City's public realm, 14% consists of parks, 26% streets and sidewalks. In New York City, 40% of the city was in the public realm, the public hands. But unfortunately, it's divided up by departments. The average citizen, when they're walking or a tourist visiting, they don't know if it's managed by the Parks Department or Department of Transportation. And guess what? They don't care, but the agencies do. And so far too often, the public realm is given too much to cars and not enough to people. And as Camille said, we want our public space to be people-centered, not car-centered. And so this transformation in London and Madrid and Paris are underway to take back the public realm and give it back to the public. I'll share what we did in New York City. I happened to read something that Frederick Olmsted wrote, and he said the sidewalk adjacent to the park should be considered the outer park. In fact, our city charter said the same thing. So I told my staff, from now on, when you see a sidewalk next to a park, it is now the outer park. And what you see there was now converted to a bioswale, because it is the outer park, not just a sidewalk. And New York City is gate and fence happy. There's a poor dog just wants to sniff some grass, but they can't because they have this barrier. And so we took aim at this outer park, at how to integrate our public spaces to park spaces to create more of a seamless public realm. And so we started taking aim at these fences. This one confused me. I thought the Parks Department thought the trees would run away at night, so they put a fence around it. And when I started recommending that we start to remove these fences so people are better connected to nature, people said, you can't take the fences down. It's going to make us less safe. Really? Can you tell me what's happening halfway down the block? Now, in New York, 7 feet, but it also has spikes, as if someone's going to vandalize and beat up the seesaw. I don't get it. But that was the attitude, and so it took some education, and then we came up with this concept they call Parks Without Borders. It started as a pilot, because that's when you want to test some of the public's money. And so it was a very, very successful effort as part of our One NYC to build a strong and just city. The approach is simple. It's just looking at the edges, entrances. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry about that. So the approach is very simple. It's a design approach looking at the entrances, edges, and adjacent park spaces. So we looked at those entrances to better connect people with nature, make it easier to get in without any barriers. We looked at the edges about lowering fences. Women and seniors in particular want to see their sight lines to feel safe. And so we lower the fence, but also connect people visually to nature. Parks close, but sidewalks never close. So put more street furniture on the sidewalk. So if you're a senior, you want to take a rest, your mother want to take a break to feed your child, you have the space to do that. And then these park adjacent spaces we had wrapped up behind these fences absolutely made no sense. So example of this is Traverse Park. This is in Queens. We tested this concept with other agencies, and we took a park, a street, and merged them all together to create a large footprint. Once again, Robert Moses playground with a tall fence, person walking the dog, no one's even paying attention to that space. So I want you to take note of where the trees are located. We absolutely transformed those streets, and now we brought the whole park experience out to the sidewalk, the outer park. And as I said, these spaces are outdoor living rooms, so we made them very intimate. We don't like having all our benches side by side, as if, Camille, how are you doing? Oh, Mitch, I'm doing okay. Who puts all their furniture up against the wall? It has to be interactive. Make these outdoor living rooms. So we brought that experience out to the street. That road, that street that was closed, looked like this. More pop-up before, but now it's more intentional, where they have festivals and fairs and events. And then here's the finished product. Doing exactly what it's supposed to do. The park is closed, but the cycle isn't closed. And now look at all these conversations, different ages engaging, enjoying a very nice summer night. Using a different lens to look at public space. I'm now going to talk about inclusion. There's a whole story behind this slide, but don't have time. But to me, to talk about inclusion really means for all people, avoid designing exclusive places. And to me, the telltale sign is that you can say, I feel welcome here, I belong here. That to me is the test. So believe it or not, I couldn't believe it, but we actually had a sign in a public park that said you couldn't loiter. Now, folks, let me stop here for a second to explain to you loitering means to stand or wait around idly without an apparent purpose. Newsflash, that's what you do in a park. But it could be weaponized, that rule, and it was weaponized. You see a nice white couple sitting there enjoying themselves, how lovely, 5 black and brown teenagers, excuse me, we have some loitering. And we had to do something, so in 2017, New York City removed loitering as a rule, as part of our Criminal Justice Reform Act, because our teens were being targeted in public space. So because I'm commissioner, you should not be surprised. So we started in parks the Yes Loitering Project. And our goal was to investigate how teens might feel excluded from or targeted in public space. That was our way of how to create more youth-powered spaces, and it was very impactful. If parks are for all, are teens part of all? And the answer is yes. And then New York, please tell me you don't have this in Louisiana. We have this sign in New York City. I got so upset when I saw this sign that I wanted to have a concession outside of every park with this sign so an adult could rent a child just to go into the park. Well, I didn't want to do that, and so we changed all the signs because it wasn't accessible, it wasn't fair, it was exclusive. And so there's a history about this sign, so that is something that we were able to change. I'm going to skip the next slide and just kind of share a little bit about my reflections on disruption as I come to a close and talk about our climate challenge. You know, I have to tell you, in August of 2020, I was very impacted by all the disruptions, by running a staff. Corey we were on calls during that time of running a parks department during COVID, and then the civil and social unrest started happening, and it was really affecting a lot of people deeply. And I was probably at the lowest point in my life and reached out to mental health experts to understand what we should do. They gave us a class that changed our lives. They talked about how stress is important. You have a deadline, you need that adrenaline, but long-term stress leads to anxiety, and long-term anxiety leads to trauma. And during COVID, these were some of the things, the physical, emotional, behavioral, cognitive, spiritual, feeling emptiness or loss of purpose, fear, social withdrawal. I was going through this, my staff was going through this, New Yorkers were going through this, you were going through this. And so we had to figure out how to understand self-care and what can we do in a park space to help people's mental health. I mean, this was powerful stuff. And we were able to pivot. And so little did I know there was a Trauma Stewardship Institute, and we brought them in, and they shared with us some tips of how to deal with it. Now, this was trauma from COVID, and sometimes I think about what about the generational trauma that Camille talked about that some communities are dealing with throughout our country. But as a survival guide, it talked about spend time with animals, laugh, admire art, go outdoors. And we want to play a role somehow in helping our community. Even in our office, we had kittens and little kittens and puppies people can pet. The line of staff was going out the door. But it helped. It helped during a very difficult period. And that's when I realized that our parks and greenways became our sanctuaries of sanity, because parks have the power to heal and bring joy. Even more so, that parks should be considered part of our healthcare system, which is why we make sure that every community has access to a quality park. So to continue on our joy of helping the community, we came up with this little sign here. We put 2,000 of these around New York City trees because you couldn't hug a person. So we said, okay, it's okay to hug me. On Instagram, it took off. There's LeVar Burton hugging trees. You know, one woman with her foot out to show how much she loved the tree. She said she could really feel something. We said, okay, we'll go with it. But was our way of helping dealing, at least from mental health, the trauma that people were going through from COVID. The next story I'm going to share with you is there it is, I'm sorry. Going back again. Okay, there's LeVar. So let me stop quickly here for a second. So after the death of George Floyd, our staff was traumatized. I remember my allies asking me, what can I do? And I told them that's the wrong question. The question you should be asking me is, how do I feel? If you ask me, how do I do, it's about you. If you ask me, how do I feel, it's about me. And so I took that to heart, and we had these reflection calls with staff to share how they felt about what happened. The stories were painful, and out of the conversations, they wanted to do something. And so I came up with the idea of naming a space, Juneteenth Grove, also known as Freedom Day. And we found a space in Brooklyn. I said it had to be special. And so the space you're seeing in Cadman Plaza, and I remember my staff called me and said, "Boss, there are 19 benches." And so we decided to paint the 19 benches to Pan-African colors, named the space Juneteenth Grove, and we planted 19 trees. Juneteenth Grove was officially opened in June of 2020, before it was a national holiday. For us to do the healing, my staff, all of us, helped put this space together. We painted the benches, and I prayed for the tree that I planted as a way of showing connection to both our ancestors, but those that will be in that space and those that will follow. On Juneteenth of 2021, when it became an official holiday, I went by this park and it was filled with so much joy. People felt I belonged here. It was special. You heard the laughter, the joy. Everything was what this space was meant to be had happened. And so I just want to remind you about thinking about giving a sense of belonging. It was a small intervention, but it was so impactful for the community. I'm going to close on resiliency because this is something that, as Parks Commissioner, I did not know I'd have to confront. While I was there, we had storm surges and floods. We had weather events where 26,000 trees came down in New York City. Freak storms in November because leaves were still on the trees that they fell. On the operations side, and we had to clean it up, so I came face to face because New York City, like your state, is a coastal city. 520 miles of coastline and 155 miles are within parks. Superstorm Sandy for us was a wake-up call. Damaged close to $1 billion, but affected close to 400 park sites. But look at 2/3 of the most vulnerable population live within a half mile of a flood zone, and they were impacted. This was a wake-up call for New York City. And so in our One NYC effort, we came up with a design for a resilient city, for neighborhoods, for buildings, for infrastructure, and for coastal defense. I'm going to share with you some about the coastal defense because it came under my portfolio. We mapped out the risk in our entire city and had to communicate what we had to do. In some cases, we did manage retreat and did buyouts in Staten Island. In other places, we actually built infrastructure, protect people and property. We came up with 2 critical guidelines. You can download both. One, the one I was involved in, is design and planning for flood resiliency guides for New York City parks, which are still in effect today. And so we knew we couldn't stop storm surges, but we came up with 3 efforts of natural system-based approach, hard structures-based approach, and an integrated flood protection. I'm just going to share 2 of those. In Long Island City, we now designed floodable parks. This is intended to flood, which means there aren't any recreation in it. When the tide rises or a storm surge, it can absorb it. In fact, you see this little bridge here. At high tide or flooding, it actually creates an island, which is pretty cool. But it's our way of recognizing that we have to build very differently since we're a coastal city. So this is more of the natural-based system approach, as well as in the book, you'll see things about wetlands and guidelines and tidal wetlands. But this one, which is under construction right now and in the news often, this is East River Park that got flooded in Lower East Side. We lost well over 200 trees because they weren't salt tolerant. And so this is a park, if you go to New York City now, it does not exist. It's scraped down to the dirt. I cannot tell you the drama involved. People say they want protection against climate change until you put out a proposal to do climate change. We had to wipe the park and elevate it 8 to 10 feet. So that we would be protected at least up until 2080, and then we could even raise it further with walls to protect it to 2100. This was vicious and ugly. It's probably one of the things people still hate me for being commissioner, but my goal, purpose-driven, protect people and property. This is what the new design looks like. It's now elevated 8 to 10 feet. The advantage is you now have at-grade crossings versus having these other, what they call switchbacks to get down to the park. And so right now this is under construction, New York, $1.5 billion park, but it was our goal to protect people and property, and now has this what we call a get down, where you now can get down to the park, but this is now the seawall that's going to protect from storm surge in the future. One of the most, to me, overlooked opportunity to address adaptation, mitigation, is street trees, park trees, forest trees. New York City went crazy planting our trees, and you'll see what I mean for a second. We had a Million Tree campaign started under Mayor Bloomberg, but it was finished under my watch. It was supposed to be a 10-year effort. We completed it in 8 years. Street trees, forest trees, and then trees on private property. I just want you to look at the benefits of a tree. If you look, it removes the tons of air pollution, captures carbon, reduces energy cost, runoff estimated in terms of gallons, 1.9 billion. The simple thing of just having a street tree or tree strategy to address climate change. Because we believe heavily into equity, we made sure there were a lot of neighborhoods that did not have sufficient trees to keep their neighborhoods cool. So you can see the before and after, and there's a strategic effort to plant those street trees because of all the benefits of clean air, clean water, and temperatures. And in fact, knowing New York City, we had to be cool. We call it the Cool Neighborhoods Effect, where we actually focused on cooling those places that had a hot heat vulnerability index. And you can see where it is. These are some of the poorest neighborhoods that were the darkest. By just a tree, addressing health, addressing safety, but also addressing climate. So as I close and we do our work, I want to remind you that there are some unjust practices past and present that's still going on, including hazard areas and flood zones. And we have to be sensitive and understand and acknowledge some of the past harm because the implications may still be present today. Very often when I talk about repairing past harm, people said it didn't happen under my watch, this stuff. Well, I know, but you can imagine if there was a manufacturing company that contaminated a site in your city, and then today is still contaminated and saying, well, I'm not going to clean it up because it didn't happen under my watch, but it's here now, and we now have obligation. And there are many communities that are still dealing with the toxicity created by these unjust practices. We have to pay attention to past harm. So as I close, when it comes to your professional obligation to protect the public welfare, is your approach intentional or incidental? Is it explicit or implicit? We are experiencing significant disruptions and emerging challenges. And now more than ever, we have to understand our professional obligation to serve the public interest and to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. I encourage all of you this morning as you go throughout this summit to embrace your sense of purpose, our codes, and our values as we plan for the future, but also address past harm. Climate change is the most significant threat of our generation. So let's commit ourselves to our purpose and pledge today to be guardians, to be healers, and to be protectors. Why? Because our community needs us, our country needs us, but most importantly, our planet needs us. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Mitch, for that incredibly inspirational presentation and discussion about the importance of our parks, green space, health, climate, and equity to build resilience. So now I would like to introduce you to our governor, who needs no introduction, Governor JohnBel Edwards, who's been a champion for planning and resilience in this state. Never has an administration before been faced with so many disasters. From the 2016 floods, right when he took office, to the 2019 floods, to drought in North Louisiana and hurricanes Laura and Ida. Governor Edwards has risen to the occasion, understanding that the quickening pace and intensity of these disasters isn't just bad luck. It's being driven by climate change, and he has made climate change mitigation and adaptation a priority for his administration. He's been a leader in the adaptive governance at the state level. He's also installed the first Chief Resilience Officer for our state and the creation of the Gulf South's first climate action plan. He recognizes how critical this is to our future, and we all need to keep future administrations accountable to building on the important work that Governor Edwards has begun. So please help me welcome Governor Edwards.
Good morning, everybody. It is great to be with you this morning. I am excited. I want to thank Camille for the introduction, but more than that, for her work at CPEX. And for all of you, yeah, please. And for all of you who are public servants and engineers and landscape architects and planners, whatever your role may be, thank you for being here today and tomorrow to take advantage of the programming and the expertise to learn from one another and to collectively reaffirm your commitment to moving our state and your communities forward. I know the major themes of the conference are climate, health, equity, and resilience. And quite frankly, I think those are the most important things we have to deal with right now in Louisiana. And I want to brag a little bit, ever mindful that we have challenges that we need to overcome, some of which have been with us for a long time, others are relatively new. But I do want to brag a little bit to you all about some of the things that together we have been able to accomplish along these themes as we move towards better, safer, and healthier communities across the state. But I want to start by recognizing Camille and CPEX for some of the things that they have done in bringing about these successes. The fact of the matter is, it is nonprofits like CPEX and others around the state that play a vital role and help us to accomplish our goals. Nonprofits push government to move faster than we think possible, and then they actually make it possible. To be more ambitious than we think the political forces will allow, to try new things, and to think beyond the one-year budget cycle and the four-year election cycle. All of these things are important if we want to move our state forward. CPEX in particular has helped to connect us here in Louisiana to global and national experts as we grapple with really difficult problems and craft our strategy and identify our resources to make the most of the opportunities that are in front of us. So for example, CPEX helped bring the entire administration together to collaborate on important topics like adapting to the coastal crisis in 2018, which led to our adaptive governance initiative. And again in 2021 to capitalize and strategize on how to make the most of the unprecedented levels of federal funding available through the bipartisan infrastructure law. And next month, we're going to gather again so that CPEX, and working with us, we can determine, I like to call it an azimuth check. Are we heading in the direction that we said last year we wanted to go in order to fully take advantage of the bipartisan infrastructure law? Camille was also a part of the state's delegation to COP26 in Scotland last year, where she helped arrange meetings with other leaders of cities, states, and nations in the private sector who were interested in Louisiana's story. She was a member of the Climate Initiatives Task Force and co-chairwoman of the Land Use and Building Sector Committee. I know that that's a lot of work, and I want to thank Camille for her leadership. And by the way, there are several other things that I could have easily put in here. CPEX has also been providing the staff to support our cross-government holistic approach to resilience building with our Chief Resilience Officer. She talked to you about that just a moment ago, which has put Louisiana again on the forefront of this discussion. But we have done many things that I'm really proud of that build resilience, foster equity, improve health, and address the causes and the impacts of climate change. And what I think is interesting about a lot of the examples I'm going to give is that they all seemed really hard, almost impossible. And you're talking about things that very few people in our state and across the country were even thinking about, much less talking about just a few years ago. And they seemed really hard until we did them. The first thing I want to mention was actually the easiest big decision I've made as governor. On my first official day in office, we expanded Medicaid for the working poor of our state. Today, we have about 750,000 Louisianans with health insurance coverage as a result of that by taking advantage of the Medicaid expansion. Not only has this literally saved lives and helped people lead healthier lives, it's also relieved one of the biggest financial burdens on working people, but it also was good for our budget. And in Louisiana, unlike a number of other southern states that didn't expand Medicaid, we've not had a single rural hospital closure. And that is very important for our state. When you're sick and you can't afford to get better, you can't do all you need to do in your family, at your job, or in your community, and you certainly can't make big plans for the future or recover from a natural disaster. And if you were sick, the COVID pandemic was especially hard on you, because we know that those most at risk for poor outcomes were those with comorbid health conditions. Another important accomplishment was the bipartisan criminal justice reform that we did 5 years ago. Where we were the outlier is we had 2.5 to 3 times as many nonviolent offenders in prison than other states with similar crime rates. We were spending $700 million a year for that system, and we were not safer as a result. And we recognized that 95% of those people were going to get out of prison. We just weren't doing very much to prepare them for success. And every unsuccessful reentry creates at least one new victim of crime. But in those 5 years, our prison population for nonviolent offenders has been cut in half. More than $100 million has been reinvested to support victims and prevent recidivism. And caseloads are much better. In fact, we're at the standard for the nation on caseloads for our parole officers. And we actually have more violent offenders in prison today than when we started this effort in 2017. But we focused on nonviolent, non-sex offenders, and it's exactly the right thing to do. We've also boosted the amount of local tax dollars that stay in local government by reforming the industrial tax exemption program. The program now simply and rightly gives local communities a say in how their local tax dollars get spent and whether they're going to be exempted. Since we changed how ITEP exemptions are made by tying ITEP to jobs and limiting the exemption to 80%, we have doubled the number and value of ITEP projects while increasing local funding for police, public schools, and other local services by more than $750 million. You certainly need jobs to build better communities, but you have to have a tax base as well to provide all the services and to meet all the demands, and we are doing both of those by changing the ITEP program. And another example, I think it was someone at this summit last year who said resilience begins with a paycheck. That obviously is true, because if you don't have a paycheck, if your family doesn't have that level of support, it is very hard to be resilient. It is very hard to recover. It's very hard to do those things that you need to do to prepare for, respond to, or recover from whatever kind of disaster your family may face. The good news is today we have the lowest unemployment rate ever measured in the state of Louisiana. It's 3.3% for the seasonally adjusted rate. It's 3.1% for the non-adjusted rate. In fact, for each of the last 5 months, we've set records for low unemployment in the state of Louisiana. And oddly enough, it's the labor market that the Fed believes is driving inflation. And so they're working against us with all the rate increases, trying to soften the labor market. And thus far, every time they raise rates, our unemployment goes down. That obviously can't continue much longer. But it gives you an idea of what we have going on in the state of Louisiana. So many of these important successes were about fixing the systems we have in place today. I'm also satisfied that we're making headway in the ways that we've been able to build a path to the future, and that means investing in infrastructure, being proactive about addressing the impacts of climate change, and preparing our economy to thrive, even as we move aggressively to a zero carbon emission world. Louisiana has the first net zero commitment in the Gulf South. We also have the Gulf South's only climate action plan to get us there. We will host the first offshore wind energy lease sale in the Gulf of Mexico next year. We have seen hundreds of megawatts of solar projects approved and move into construction from all of our major utilities. And we welcomed an incredible $21 billion in new and expanded industrial projects to support low or no carbon activities. And all of that since 2021. All of this is from a state where many thought that if we simply said climate change, if we uttered the words, if we acknowledged it, that some companies would immediately think about moving to Texas or to Mexico or wherever. Well, it turns out that the major companies are sending the opposite message, telling us that we better address climate change and make renewable energy available to them, or else they're going to take a hard look at leaving Louisiana, or at least not investing in Louisiana. This is quite a paradigm shift, and we are on the right side of it. We're on the right side of it for all the reasons that you can imagine. First of all, Louisiana, as you know, is the state in the country most adversely affected by climate change. When you think that we've lost 2,000 square miles of coast since 1930, when you know that the severity and frequency of our storms is just increasing, sea level is rising, coastal erosion is taking away that storm buffer. And just over the last 3 years now, because I'm very thankful that this hurricane season just concluded, was the best in 31 years. But the two before that, we had 5 hurricanes, 2 of which were the strongest ever hit our state. All of this happened during the course of a pandemic. But my point to you is we are most adversely affected by climate change, and on a per capita basis, we're emitting more CO2 than anybody else in the country. We have to do something about that. That is a moral imperative for us. And it just so happens that even the oil and gas companies are rebranding as energy companies and making their own commitments to net zero, to decarbonization. And CEOs of companies, whether they're energy companies or manufacturing companies, you name it, they're being told by their boards of directors and their shareholders that they are responsible for reaching their own internal climate goals. If they can't do that in Louisiana, that investment is not coming to Louisiana. And I have always viewed, and the reason we went to COP26 last year in Scotland was to make sure the world knows that the state of Louisiana understands that climate change is real. We know that human behavior contributes to it. And we are serious about our climate action plan. And we view it both as climate action and economic development. And that is exactly how it is playing out in Louisiana. And it is positioning us, I believe, to do better in the long run and to be able to better compete against our neighbors, many of whom don't acknowledge climate change is real. They think that any capital flowing to a low carbon future is woke capital. I'm not even sure what that means, by the way. But it's real capital, and we'll welcome it in Louisiana. It'll support our economy, and it's going to create a lot of jobs. And if we want to be an energy leader 100 years from now, just like we've been over the last 100 years, we better embrace the transition. Otherwise, it's like an off-ramp on an interstate that leads to absolutely nowhere. So that is what we're doing in Louisiana around climate change. We just marked the 1-year anniversary of the federal bipartisan infrastructure law. Louisiana has already claimed more than $4 billion in funds for 120 projects. And remember, this is a 5-year program. We're just in year number 1. This includes $5.9 billion over 5 years for transportation funding, $479 million of that for public transit, $44 million for electric school buses, $73 million for electrical vehicle charging stations over 5 years, $26.5 million of that has already been allocated. We've already received $100 million minimum broadband, and we're the first state in the nation to actually receive money from the bipartisan infrastructure law for broadband. But I'm going to tell you, the FCC maps have been done. Some states are challenging them. But we know that we're going to receive more than $1 billion more for broadband that we will use for gumbo grants. We're going to put matching dollars from the internet service providers on top of that, and we will close the digital divide in Louisiana before 2029. I'm very excited about our efforts there. And by the way, I can flat out tell you that other states are emulating what we are doing in Louisiana around broadband, and I want to thank all of the internet service providers, but also want to thank the folks who work in our office, in the governor's office, led by Vineeth Iyengar on that. I think you probably saw where $320 million will go to 2 companies in Louisiana who are manufacturing components for electric batteries for vehicles. $101 million in improvements to water systems, $31 million for weatherization, $52 million for the cleanup of polluting, obsolete oil and gas infrastructure in brownfields, and $2.9 billion for hurricane recovery and protection via the Corps of Engineers that adds to that resiliency that we need. And that is what we know of right now. And most of the competitive grant programs are just now coming online. And you cannot be competitive for those dollars if you're not thinking about climate change, if you don't build in equity, if you're not paying good wages to the people who are going to do the work. Because we've been told by the administration, this is how we're going to grade your submissions. And so when you look at that and you overlay it with the theme of this meeting, you know that we are exactly in the right spot. It goes beyond saying that I am proud of these accomplishments, but it also goes without saying that our work is not done. We still have lots of challenges to overcome. We have, in my administration, about 13 months left before I will depart the scene. And I can assure you we're going to work hard every single day between now and then to make as much progress as we can possibly make. And even when we leave the governor's office, you all will still be busy at work. All the people in this room, all the organizations like the Center for Planning Excellence will have to carry all of this forward and put pressure on whoever is going to follow me in the governor's office, on members of that administration, just like you have put pressure on me. That's going to be your job. And I know you're going to do that. And so I want to thank you for that. Addressing climate change and building resilience is not just about solar power. It's not just about industrial decarbonization. There is a tremendous role for planners, urban designers, and landscape architects. It really will take all of us. And so this is the moment that many of you all have been waiting for, and not just idly waiting, but planning for a very long time. Because we have more resources available to us right now than we've ever had to address the most pressing challenges and issues that are before us. So I'm excited about that. That gives us tremendous opportunities. If we will work together, we can move our state forward. We can position ourselves to be more resilient. You don't need me to tell you that it is extremely challenging to have multiple hurricanes over a short period of time that cause insurance claims to be filed in record numbers and involving record amounts of damages. And the same thing is true for the federal government. Every time there's a natural disaster here and we need help for low to moderate income people, and it comes through HUD or it comes through FEMA, you've got people around the country who are saying, how long are we going to keep sending money to South Louisiana, for example? But we know that if we build in resilience, those claims are reduced. The damages are lower. We can see that with the hurricane storm damage risk reduction system that was built in parts of 5 parishes in response to Hurricane Katrina. $14 billion of taxpayer money from around the country invested there. And this past year, in 2021, Hurricane Ida hit. Very similar path to Hurricane Katrina. It was actually stronger than Hurricane Katrina, but you didn't see all the water damage. That's because that system worked. Those levees, those gates, those pumps, they worked. Somebody had to plan that. Somebody had to have that vision. And by the way, it wasn't just federal taxpayer dollars. Each of the last 2 years, we've written $400 million checks to pay the non-federal share for that. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is, if we incorporate more resilience into what we're doing in Louisiana, we all have a better future. Fewer people will be impacted by those storms. They won't be tempted to leave. They won't be tempted to close their business. And I also believe when we realize our goals in the climate change initiative, we will minimize the number of adverse events like these storms that will happen in the first place. So that's our charge. No small task, but our obligation, I think, to our neighbors here in Louisiana is to make sure that we're moving forward every single day. You all do that, and I'm here to simply say thank you and encourage you to keep it up, and I know that you will, and have a wonderful Christmas. And I pray that 2023 will be the best year ever for you, for your family, and for our state. God bless you. Thank you.